The disappearance of the Beaumont children. The air was thick with the sweltering heat of an Australian summer, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer like a mirage, blurring the edges of reality. I remember that day as if it were yesterday, the day the Beaumont children vanished. It was January 26, 1966, a day like any other, a day that should have been filled with the simple joys of childhood, but instead it became the day that forever changed a nation. Jane, Arna, and Grant Beaumont were just three ordinary kids, full of life and excitement, eager to spend the day at Glenelg Beach. They were the picture of innocence, with their wide-eyed smiles and sun-kissed faces. Jane, the eldest at 9, had been entrusted by their mother to look after her younger siblings. It was a simpler time back then, a time when parents didn't worry about letting their children roam free. No one could have predicted the horror that was to come. I can still see the beach that day, crowded with families, the sound of laughter mixing with the crashing waves. The children were seen playing, building sandcastles, and splashing in the surf. Witnesses later reported seeing them talking to a man, someone no one recognized, but who seemed friendly enough. But who really knows what lurks behind a smile? The clock ticked on, and as the afternoon wore on, the Beaumont children never returned home. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the sand, but there was no sign of the three siblings. Panic began to rise like a tide in the hearts of their parents, who frantically searched the beach, calling out their names. But all they were met with was silence. As the night fell, the search intensified. The police were called in, and soon the beach was flooded with searchlights and officers combing every inch of sand. But it was as if the children had simply vanished into thin air. No footprints, no discarded belongings, nothing. The investigation that followed was massive, one of the largest in Australian history. But despite all the efforts, the Beaumont children were never found. The case became a haunting mystery, the kind that seeps into your bones and refuses to let go. And then the letters began to arrive. It was a few weeks after the disappearance when the first letter was delivered to the Beaumont home. It was addressed to their parents, written in a childish scrawl. The letter claimed to be from Jane, stating that they were being held by a man who wanted money. The letter was eerily calm, too calm for a child in distress. But the most chilling detail was the way the letter described a hidden place, a place deep within the sand dunes that no one knew existed. The police followed the instructions in the letter, combing the dunes, digging through the sand in search of any clue, but once again, they found nothing. And just as quickly as they appeared, the letter stopped, but the unease lingered, a heavy cloud that refused to lift. The sightings came next. People reported seeing the children in various places, walking down a deserted road, standing at the edge of a forest, or peering through the window of an abandoned house. But every time the police investigated, they were met with dead ends. It was as if the children were ghosts, slipping in and out of reality, always just out of reach. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, hope began to fade. The case grew cold, but the questions never stopped. What happened to the Beaumont children? Where did they go? And who was the mysterious man they were seen with that day on the beach? But the most terrifying question of all, the one that keeps me up at night, the one that makes my skin crawl, is this. What if they were never alone on that beach? What if something far darker and more malevolent was at play? Something that still lingers, waiting in the shadows, watching, and biding its time. Days turned into weeks, and the search for the Beaumont children became a national obsession. The media swarmed the story, desperate for any new detail that could bring the three siblings back home. But despite the endless headlines, the story only grew colder, like a fading ember refusing to die out. I remember the way the Beaumont house looked during those weeks, a stark contrast to the sunny beach where the children were last seen. It was a place shrouded in a suffocating silence, interrupted only by the sobs of their distraught mother and the whispers of neighbors who came by to offer condolences. The once vibrant home had become a mausoleum of lost hope. But then something happened, something that reignited the fear in all of us. It was a dark, moonless night when the first noise was heard. Mrs. Beaumont swore she heard the sound of laughter coming from the backyard. At first, she thought it was her mind playing tricks on her. But as the nights went on, the noises grew louder. Footsteps on the gravel, the faint sound of children giggling, and once the unmistakable creak of the back gate swinging open. Mr. Beaumont tried to reassure his wife, dismissing the sounds as the wind or animals, but there was a look in his eyes that betrayed his own unease. The next morning, they found small footprints in the dirt beneath the kitchen window, footprints that matched the size of Jane, Arna, and Grant. The police were called again, and once more the house was flooded with officers. They scoured the yard, searched the surrounding neighborhood, but found nothing. It was as if the children were toying with them, leaving traces of their presence, but never revealing themselves. And then more letters arrived. This time they were different, no longer written in a childish hand, but instead in a script that was jagged and erratic, as if the writer was in a state of panic. The letters spoke of a man who had taken them, a man who was growing more unstable by the day. They begged their parents for help, but the most chilling part was the mention of the others. The letters described other children, lost souls who had been taken over the years, forced to live in darkness, trapped in a place that wasn't of this world. The descriptions were vague, but the fear was palpable. The letters hinted that something ancient and evil had claimed the children, something that fed on their innocence, something that could never be satisfied. It was then that Mrs. Beaumont began to see them. Not just hear them, but see her children. At first, it was just a glimpse, a shadow at the corner of her eye, a fleeting image in the reflection of a window. But soon, they appeared more frequently. She would find Jane standing in the hallway, her expression blank, her eyes dull and lifeless. Arna would be sitting at the kitchen table, her hands clasped in front of her as if waiting for something. And Grant, poor little Grant. He would be crouched in the corner of the living room, his small body shivering as if he were freezing. But every time Mrs. Beaumont tried to reach out to them, they would vanish, dissolving into the air like mist. She grew desperate, pleading with them to come back, to stay, but they were always just out of reach. The strain took its toll on the Beaumont family. Mr. Beaumont, unable to cope with the mounting terror, began to drink heavily, his once strong frame now slumped and defeated. Mrs. Beaumont, gaunt and hollow-eyed, became obsessed with the letters, convinced that they held the key to finding her children. She would spend hours poring over them, looking for clues, trying to make sense of the madness that had consumed their lives. And then there was the night that the doorbell rang. It was late, past midnight, and the house was still. Mrs. Beaumont had just drifted off to sleep when the sound of the bell cut through the silence like a knife. She jolted awake, her heart pounding in her chest. She waited, thinking she must have imagined it, but then it rang again, louder this time, more insistent. She stumbled to the front door, her hands trembling as she reached for the handle. She paused for a moment, a cold dread seizing her. But the bell rang a third time, and she knew she had to answer. When she opened the door, she found nothing but the empty night. The street was deserted, the darkness thick and oppressive. But just as she was about to close the door, she noticed something on the doorstep. A small brown package, neatly wrapped with a string. With trembling hands, she picked it up and brought it inside. She sat down at the kitchen table, the package before her, her breath shallow and uneven. She knew she should wait for her husband, but something compelled her to open it. She reached for a pair of scissors and carefully cut the string. Inside was a small worn-out teddy bear, Jane's favorite toy, the one she had taken to the beach that day, and beneath it, folded neatly, was another letter. But this one was different. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and the ink was faded, almost illegible. As she unfolded the letter, a strange smell filled the room, a mixture of salt water and decay. The letter was short, just a few lines, but the words sent a chill down her spine. "They are with me now. You will never see them again, but they will see you." The lights in the kitchen flickered, and in the dim glow, Mrs. Beaumont saw something that made her blood run cold. Reflected in the kitchen window was the faint outline of 3 small figures, standing just behind her, their faces twisted in silent screams. The terror that gripped the Beaumont household after that night was unlike anything I had ever witnessed. Mrs. Beaumont was never the same. Her eyes, once warm and full of life, now held a haunted look, as if she was constantly staring into the abyss. She refused to leave the house, convinced that her children were still there, somewhere, waiting for her to find them. Mr. Beaumont tried to keep things together, but the strain was too much. He would sit in his armchair, staring blankly at the walls, the bottle of whiskey in his hand trembling as he took long, desperate sips. The once close-knit family was unraveling, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. But the worst part was the nights. Every evening, like clockwork, the noises would start. The soft giggles, the sound of running feet, and the occasional thud of something heavy being dragged across the floor. The police came several more times, but they found nothing, and soon they stopped responding to the frantic calls from the Beaumont home. It was around this time that the sightings began to spread beyond the house. Neighbors reported seeing the children in their yards, standing at the edge of the street, or peering out from behind trees. One neighbor, an elderly woman who lived alone, claimed that she saw Jane standing at the foot of her bed one night, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken. The woman swore that Jane whispered something to her, something about a dark place where the children were trapped. But by the time she fully awoke, the girl was gone. The letters continued to arrive, each one more disturbing than the last. They spoke of a place beneath the earth, a place where the children were kept in perpetual darkness, unable to escape. The letters described a ritual, an ancient practice that required the souls of the innocent to appease a force older than time itself. The more Mrs. Beaumont read, the more unhinged she became. convinced that she could somehow bring her children back if she just understood what the letters were telling her. And then one night, something changed. It was a cold, windy evening, the kind where the wind howls through the trees, making them sway like skeletal figures in the darkness. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards as the wind pressed against the old walls. Mr. Beaumont had finally passed out in his chair, the bottle of whiskey slipping from his fingers, while Mrs. Beaumont sat at the kitchen table, staring at the latest letter. As she read the words, something caught her eye, a small, barely noticeable mark at the bottom of the page. It was an address, scrawled in the same jagged handwriting. The address was unfamiliar, but the name of the place sent a shiver down her spine. The Cave of Shadows. She didn't know why, but she felt compelled to go there, as if something was drawing her to that place. She knew it was foolish, but the pull was too strong to resist. She grabbed her coat and slipped out of the house, the wind whipping around her as she made her way to the car. The drive was long and treacherous, the winding roads barely visible in the dim headlights. The landscape grew more desolate the further she drove, the trees closing in around her like a suffocating embrace. After what felt like hours, she arrived at the location, an old abandoned quarry on the outskirts of town. The place was overgrown with weeds, the entrance to the cave barely visible through the tangled vines. Mrs. Beaumont hesitated for a moment, fear gnawing at her insides. But then she heard it, the faint sound of children's laughter echoing from deep within the cave. It was unmistakable. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped out of the car and made her way toward the entrance. The darkness inside the cave was absolute, swallowing her whole as she ventured deeper. The sound of laughter grew louder, more distinct, but it was twisted, warped, as if coming from a place that defied the natural order of things. Her breath came in short gasps, the walls of the cave closing in around her, and then she saw them. The cave opened into a large chamber, illuminated by a sickly green light that seemed to emanate from the very walls. In the center of the chamber stood Jane, Arna, and Grant, their backs turned to her, their bodies rigid and unnaturally still. "Jane?" Mrs. Beaumont's voice trembled as she called out to her daughter. "Arna, Grant?" The children slowly turned to face her, and the sight that met her eyes made her blood run cold. Their faces were gaunt, their skin a deathly pale, their eyes black voids that reflected nothing but darkness. But it was their smiles, the twisted, unnatural smiles that stretched across their faces, that sent a wave of terror crashing over her. "Mommy," Jane whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally in the chamber. "We've been waiting for you." Mrs. Beaumont stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to run, to escape the nightmare that was unfolding before her, but her legs refused to move. The children began to advance toward her, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes on invisible strings. "We want you to join us," Arna said, her voice cold and hollow. "Come with us, Mommy. Come to the dark place." Mrs. Beaumont finally found the strength to move, turning on her heel and sprinting back toward the cave entrance. The children's laughter echoed behind her, growing louder and more maniacal with each step she took. She burst out of the cave, the cold night air hitting her like a slap in the face, and she didn't stop running until she reached the car. She drove home in a daze, her mind racing, trying to comprehend what she had just witnessed. When she finally arrived back at the house, she was shaking, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. She knew then that whatever had taken her children was not of this world. It was something ancient, something evil, and it had claimed them as its own. But the worst part was the realization that came crashing down on her like a tidal wave. Her children were no longer hers. They belonged to the darkness now, and there was nothing she could do to bring them back. The next morning, Mrs. Beaumont was found by her husband, sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the letter in her hands. Her eyes were hollow, her face pale as death. She had aged 10 years overnight, the terror of what she had seen etched into every line of her face. But the worst part was the expression on her lips. A twisted, unnatural smile, the same smile that had haunted her in the cave. The days following Mrs. Beaumont's terrifying discovery were marked by a descent into madness. The once vibrant home had become a house of horrors, with shadows lurking in every corner and an overwhelming sense of dread hanging in the air. Mr. Beaumont, now a shell of his former self, did his best to care for his wife. But she was beyond his reach, lost in the grip of an unseen force. The twisted smile that had marred Mrs. Beaumont's face that fateful night never left. She barely spoke, only murmuring incomprehensible words about the dark place and the others. She would sit for hours, staring out the window, her eyes vacant, as if she were waiting for something or someone. And then the nightmares began. Mr. Beaumont was the first to experience them. Night after night, he found himself trapped in a recurring dream. He was standing on the beach where his children had disappeared, the sun blazing overhead. But the beach was deserted. The only sound was the relentless crashing of the waves. but there was something wrong with them. They weren't natural. The water was black, thick like tar, and with each wave it seemed to consume more of the shore. In the dream, he would hear his children's voices, faint and distorted, calling to him from somewhere beyond the horizon. He would run toward the sound, but no matter how fast he moved, the voices remained just out of reach, growing fainter and fainter until they were swallowed by the darkness. But the worst part of the dream was the man. He was always there, standing at the edge of the water, his back turned to Mr. Beaumont. The man never moved, never spoke, but his presence was suffocating, a black hole of malevolence that made Mr. Beaumont's skin crawl. Every night the dream would end the same way. Mr. Beaumont would finally reach the man, and just as he was about to grab him, the man would turn around, revealing a face that was not human, but something else. Something twisted and monstrous, a visage of pure evil. Mr. Beaumont would wake up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in his chest, but the horror of the dream lingered, seeping into his waking hours. He began to see the man everywhere, in the reflection of the bathroom mirror, in the shadowed corners of the house, in the eyes of strangers on the street. The man was always watching, always waiting. It was then that Mr. Beaumont decided he couldn't endure it any longer. He needed answers. He needed to know what had happened to his children and what this thing was that had taken over his wife and invaded his dreams. He began to dig deeper into the history of the Cave of Shadows, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain the nightmare that his life had become. What he discovered was far worse than he could have ever imagined. The Cave of Shadows was no ordinary cave. It had a dark and bloody history, stretching back centuries, to a time when the land was inhabited by an ancient indigenous tribe. The tribe believed that the cave was a gateway to the spirit world, a place where the barrier between the living and the dead was thin. They spoke of a dark entity that dwelled within the cave, an ancient evil that fed on the souls of the innocent. The tribe had conducted rituals to appease the entity, offering sacrifices to keep it from crossing over into the world of the living. But over time, the rituals were forgotten, and the cave was abandoned, left to fester like an open wound. The entity, no longer contained, began to reach out, searching for new victims to claim. And it had found the Beaumont children. The more Mr. Beaumont read, the more the pieces began to fall into place. The letters, the sightings, the man in his dreams, it all pointed to one thing. The entity had taken his children, and now it was coming for him and his wife. He knew that if he didn't act soon, they would be lost, just like Jane, Arna, and Grant. Driven by desperation, Mr. Beaumont returned to the cave, armed with nothing but a lantern and a desperate hope that he could somehow undo the horror that had befallen his family. The drive was a blur, his mind racing with thoughts of what he might find inside. When he arrived at the entrance of the cave, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the desolate landscape. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the darkness inside the cave seemed to pulse with a life of its own. But Mr. Beaumont pushed forward, the weight of his mission driving him deeper into the abyss. The cave was exactly as Mrs. Beaumont had described it. Dark, suffocating, the walls oozing with a sickly green light. But it wasn't the sight of the cave that sent a wave of terror through Mr. Beaumont. It was the voices, his children's voices echoing through the darkness, pleading for help, begging to be saved. And then he saw them. They stood in the center of the chamber, just as Mrs. Beaumont had described. Jane, Arna, and Grant, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow and lifeless. But this time they weren't alone. The man from Mr. Beaumont's dreams was there too, standing just behind them, his face obscured by the shadows. "Daddy!" Jane's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Why didn't you save us?" Mr. Beaumont's heart shattered at the sound of his daughter's voice. He wanted to rush forward, to gather his children in his arms and take them far away from this nightmare, but his feet were rooted to the spot. The man stepped forward, and as he did, the shadows peeled away, revealing his true form. The man, or rather the thing that had taken his form, was a grotesque mockery of humanity. His skin was stretched tight over his bones, his eyes sunken and filled with a darkness that seemed to reach out and consume everything it touched. His mouth was twisted into a cruel smile, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "You can't have them!" Mr. Beaumont choked out, his voice trembling with fear. The entity laughed, a low, guttural sound that reverberated through the chamber. "They are already mine," it hissed. "And soon you will be too." With a sudden movement, the entity lunged at Mr. Beaumont, its arms outstretched, its fingers like talons. Mr. Beaumont stumbled backward, his lantern slipping from his grasp and crashing to the ground. The light flickered and died, plunging the cave into complete darkness. The last thing Mr. Beaumont saw before the darkness claimed him was the twisted, smiling faces of his children, their eyes filled with a void that mirrored the entity's own. And then there was nothing. When the police arrived at the Beaumont household the following morning, they found the front door ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. Inside, the house was eerily silent. Mr. Beaumont's car was gone, and the living room was in disarray, as if someone had left in a hurry. The only sound was the faint, almost imperceptible ticking of the clock on the wall, marking the passage of time in a place where time had seemingly stopped. Mrs. Beaumont was nowhere to be found. Her chair at the kitchen table was empty, the letter she had clutched in her hand the night before, lying crumpled on the floor. The house felt abandoned, as if the life had been drained from it, leaving only an empty shell behind. The officers, seasoned in dealing with tragedies of all kinds, were unnerved by the atmosphere in the house. It was as if something malevolent still lingered in the air, watching them, waiting for them to leave so it could resume its grim work. They began their search, calling out for the Beaumonts, but there was no response. The entire house was checked, but it was empty. Empty except for one thing. In the center of the living room floor, where the children used to play, was a small brown teddy bear, worn and tattered, with one eye missing. It was Jane's favorite toy, the same one Mrs. Beaumont had found in the package on the night the horror truly began. But now, it was different. Its once soft fur was matted and dark, as if it had been soaked in something thick and sticky. One of the officers, with a growing sense of dread, reached down and picked up the bear. As he did, something fell out from within its stuffing, a small folded piece of paper. His hands trembling, the officer unfolded it, revealing a message scrawled in a jagged, almost frantic script. "They are with me. You will never find them, but they will find you." The words sent a chill down the officer's spine. He quickly handed the note to his superior who, after a moment of reading, ordered the house to be searched again. This time more thoroughly. The search extended into the backyard, and then into the surrounding neighborhood. They combed through every inch of the property, desperate to find any sign of the Beaumont family. But there was nothing. It was as if they had simply vanished, just like the children had months before. The cave was the next logical step. The officers, armed and alert, made their way to the old quarry, the memory of the tales surrounding the Cave of Shadows heavy on their minds. The drive was tense, each man gripped by a fear they couldn't quite explain. When they reached the quarry, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. The cave loomed before them, a gaping maw of darkness that seemed to beckon them in. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the oppressive atmosphere made it feel as though the cave itself was alive, pulsing with an ancient, malevolent energy. The officers hesitated at the entrance, but duty compelled them forward. As they ventured inside, their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing the slick, green-tinged walls that seemed to pulse with an unnatural light. The further they went, the more the feeling of dread intensified, until it was almost unbearable. In the main chamber, they found them. Mr. Beaumont was lying on the ground, his body twisted at an unnatural angle, his face frozen in a rictus of terror. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly into the darkness, but they were devoid of life. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his hands were clutching something tightly to his chest. As the officers approached, their breath caught in their throats. In Mr. Beaumont's hands was the teddy bear, now stained dark with blood, and around his neck was a length of rope, frayed and old, as if it had been buried for decades. But it wasn't just the sight of the body that terrified them. It was what lay beyond him. On the far side of the chamber, shrouded in shadow, were three small figures. The officers' flashlights flickered as they swept across the chamber, and when the beams finally landed on the figures, the men recoiled in horror. Jane, Arna, and Grant stood there, just as they had in the visions their parents had seen. But now their bodies were decayed, their skin a sickly gray, their eyes black voids that seemed to pull in the light. Their faces were twisted into ghastly smiles, their teeth sharp and jagged, as if they were no longer human but something else entirely. And behind them, half hidden in the shadows, was the entity. The thing that had taken the form of a man. The thing that had haunted Mr. Beaumont's dreams. Its presence was overwhelming, a suffocating darkness that seemed to swallow the air around it. It didn't move, didn't speak, but the officers could feel its gaze on them, cold and unfeeling, as if it were appraising them, deciding their fate. The children took a step forward, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes being pulled by invisible strings. One of the officers shouted, raising his weapon, but before he could fire, the lights went out. In the pitch blackness of the cave, the sounds of the children's laughter echoed around them, growing louder and more distorted, until it was almost deafening. The officers scrambled for the entrance, their hearts pounding in their chests, but it was too late. The darkness closed in, and the last thing they heard before the silence consumed them was the voice of the entity. A low, guttural whisper that chilled them to the bone. "They are mine now, and so are you." The next morning the cave was found empty. The officers who had entered it were never seen again, their disappearance adding to the long list of unsolved mysteries surrounding the Beaumont children. The case was eventually closed, deemed unsolvable, and the cave was sealed off, its entrance hidden by the authorities in an attempt to forget the horrors within. But the story didn't end there. In the years that followed, there were reports, whispers of strange sightings near the old quarry. People claimed to see 3 small figures standing at the edge of the cave, their eyes hollow, their faces twisted into ghastly smiles. Others spoke of hearing children's laughter echoing in the night, followed by the sound of footsteps in the darkness. And then there were the letters. Letters that began to arrive at the homes of those who had been involved in the investigation. Letters that bore the same jagged script as the ones sent to the Beaumonts all those years ago. The letters spoke of the dark place, of the others who had been taken, and of a force that could never be satisfied. And always they ended with the same chilling message. They are with me now. You will never see them again, but they will see you. The Beaumont house eventually fell into disrepair, abandoned by the living, but the spirits within remained. It became a place of legend, a place where no one dared to go, lest they too become part of the darkness that claimed the children. And so the story of the Beaumont children lives on, a tale of horror and despair, a mystery that will never be solved. But those who know the truth, those who have felt the presence of the entity, understand one thing all too well. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some doors should never be opened, and some things, once unleashed, can never be put back.